Good evening, everyone. My name's Richard Martin. I'm the Daskanopoulos Director of Education and Public Programmes at the Whitechapel Gallery, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this very special conversation between Theaster Gates and Magdalene and Odundo. This event is part of our Big Ideas series, which offers a platform to leading artists, architects, writers, researchers and curators to share their ideas. We're very grateful to the Stanley Picker Trust, who continue to generously support this series. For our latest Big Ideas, we're thrilled to have two incredible artists feature. Theaster Gates is one of the leading creative figures in the world, acclaimed for his interventions in urban space, especially in his hometown of Chicago, and for a practice that spans sculpture, installation, and performance. Theaster's new exhibition here at the Whitechapel Gallery is called A Clay Sermon. It runs until the 9th of January, and it explores the historical, material, and the spiritual legacies of clay. It includes ceramics, installations, and a brand new film by the artist. It's free, and I hope you all have a chance to visit soon. The show also includes ceramics that Theaster has selected from public and private collections, including some from the collection of our event partners, the V&A, where Theaster has been Emeritus Fellow at the V&A Research Institute. You can also see a further selection and an intervention by Theaster in the galleries at the V&A, also running until January. I want to take this opportunity to thank all our exhibition supporters who have made A Clay Sermon possible. White Cube, the AKO Foundation, Cocaine, the London Community Foundation, the Henry Moore Foundation, Gagosian, and Jill and Jay Bernstein. We're incredibly grateful for everyone's support. Joining Theaster in conversation is Dame Magdalene Odundo, an internationally acclaimed ceramics artist. Magdalene was born in Kenya before moving to the UK in 1971 as a student. Her work is now in the permanent collections of the V&A and the British Museum in London, as well as the Art Institute of Chicago and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Her recent exhibitions include Magdalene Odundo, The Journey of Things at Hepworth Wakefield in 2019, which brought together contemporary and historical art selected by the artist alongside her own ceramics, drawings, prints and glass installations. And currently at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, you can see a display of Magdalene's work alongside ceramics taken from the Fitzwilliam's collection. As well as being a dame and a professor, Magdalene is also Chancellor of the University for the Creative Arts. Chairing our discussion is Lydia Yee, Chief Curator here at the Whitechapel Gallery and the lead curator of Theaster's show. And later in the discussion, there will be questions and contributions from our audience here in the Zilker Auditorium. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we look forward to welcoming you to future exhibitions and events here at the Whitechapel Gallery, both in person and online.
It's a real privilege and honor to be speaking with two of the most esteemed artists working today who share a love of clay, Dame Magdalene Odundo and Chevalier Theaster Gates. In the presence of such distinguished company and in the context of an exhibition entitled A Clay Sermon, I can only begin by evoking higher powers. And quoting from the opening of Theaster's Clay Sermon, in the beginning there was clay, clay was without form. In the creation myths of many cultures and religions, from Sumerian, Chinese, and Yoruba mythology to the Quran and Jewish folktales, humans are formed from clay. The Egyptian god Khnum, who is often depicted with a ram's head and seated at a potter's wheel, is regarded as the guardian of the Nile and is believed to have made living beings from primordial mud. Similarly, in the Old Testament, God is like the potter working at the wheel. But now, O Lord, you are our Father, we are the clay, and you are potter. We are all the work of your hand. We might imagine that Homo sapiens first fashioned clay into simple utilitarian vessels to hold food or water. However, the archaeological record reveals that humans first made sculptures from clay. Small, voluptuous Venus figures appeared during the late Paleolithic era. The earliest example, the Venus of Dolní Věstonice, was unearthed in 1925 in the southern Moravian region of the Czech Republic. and this work dates from 25,000 to 30,000 years ago, predating fragments of pottery discovered in the Zhangjian province caves in China by at least 5,000 to 10,000 years. Archaeologists and anthropologists speculate that these Venus figures and similar ones carved from stone, bone, or ivory may have been used for ritual or symbolic purposes, perhaps as talismans or to promote fertility and health. But we return to our present moment. It was just yesterday that Magdalene and Theaster met for the first time. Yet, you seem to have been in conversation, or at least your work has been in conversation for quite a few years now. And this is despite the fact that you're from different generations and you... She's the young one.
That's not nice.
I'll take that.
And that you live on different continents. I wanted to start by asking, how did you learn of each other's work?
Two of my oldest friends in the world are here in the front row, Zena and Jeff. And it was this trip that I made to London from South Africa, which would have been 1996, that I met Jeff and Zena, and that I also looked up the British Craft Council and thought I'd take a gander because I was kind of a young and emerging 26 or 27-year-old maker. And I thought I should go to the British Craft Council because they had a lot of propaganda at the time. And there I learned of a few people.
Call it news here.
In that propaganda, no. But there were four names that stood out. There was Julian Stair, Michael Cardew, Bernard Leach, and Magdalene. And needless to say, the three gentlemen, their work looked quite similar, and Magdalene's looked really different. And it was the first time that I saw at an international level, or for me, a name that was identifiably Black. I'd say later I would understand it as Kenyan or African, let's say Kenyan. But there was also, there was something about the work that was like, at the time I was making really rough things, it was quite refined. And I just remember thinking, like, man, is this what British colonialism does? It takes, but there was something about the work that was like, I haven't felt this kind of ambitious mutation, before. And that was 96. No one, I couldn't even make a pot really at the time. I was quite early in my making, but it was the moment that I learned of your work.
Theaster had broken out quite rapidly in the States, but the first time I really saw or understood his work is when he had this massive exhibition in Boston, I think everybody, I was doing a residency in New Hampshire, and I think everybody was talking about Theaster Gates. And then I looked up one of his presentations at NCICA, which is a big gathering that takes place every year in the States and usually has over 4,000 people attending and lots of conferences. So it's quite surprising that you just hone in on one person. And I think I think it's still recorded in that speech. And subsequently I've followed his work.
Mm. Do you want to say something about that keynote? I think you talked about Shoji Yamaguchi and Dave the Potter as a way of constructing a lineage.
Yeah, so this is a ceramic conference. It's like the national conference for ceramic artists and teachers in Sika. And not just 4,000 people, it's largely 3,996 white people. You know? And
I wasn't going to
What
say
about the
that.
Asians?
yeah, I mean, and then there were like 2 Koreans and a Chinese cat.
I think the one you attended was more than that. There
Yeah,
were
it was a couple of
there were about 8,000
8,000
people. Yeah.
At this, so I had a morning keynote. And I remember waking up and like taking some notes, and then I entered the stage from the back, and then there was just like a sea of white faces. You know what I mean? And if there were 8,000, there were about 4,000 in the audience, and it just seemed like whatever this NCECA was, this National Conference for Ceramics, that this would be the moment to encourage the field to be more inclusive. And so it pivoted from nervousness to like a conviction pretty quickly. And I ended up challenging NCECA to, for every potter that was there, they should invite a person of color to the next NCECA. And if there were organizations that were giving money to potters to come, that they should double that amount. And as many number of people that had come that year with them, if there were 5 folk from the University of Nebraska, that there should be 10, and at least 5 of them should be of color. And over the years, people would send me an email and say, oh, you know, we took you up on that. And ceramics in America is a leisurely, it's a craft of the privileged. You could say the same probably of welding, glass blowing, jewelry making, you know, whatever your jam is. But particularly, there were communities that would form, and you know, it wasn't always inclusive.
Yeah, I think it had its tried, and there is. I have to give credit to NCECA. There is a foundation now.
Yeah.
That is inclusive. But it is a big organization. I think Britain hasn't got, we haven't got anything similar to it. And what's interesting is that it does bring in emerging artists who, like when Theaster broke through, it exposes a lot of artists.
Yes.
Into a realm of, 8,000 people is a lot of people to have in one conference. But it did expose your work.
Yes.
To a lot more people, and people started understanding a lot more what you aimed to do.
Yeah.
And I think that was a marker for people like Roberta Lugo later on.
I wanted to turn to your current exhibitions, Magdalene, yours at the Fitzwilliam and Theaster's here at Whitechapel. One of the things I was struck by is that you both have historic ceramics shown alongside your own work. The selections span from Africa to Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas. Why are historic ceramic objects important to you both? And how do you go about making your choices? And I noticed that you shared one figure in common.
Which is really surprising, because it's surprising in one way, but it isn't in another way, because Lydia Kwale is really, I think she was not just a star, pop star, but she, in her own way, working with Michael Cardew and at Abuja Pottery, in her very silent, quiet way. She was very, I think she was an elegant woman. She made the most amazing pots, and it's very difficult to actually explain what her work was. The work that was not glazed had a depth of warmth in it, but it also had a freedom of, one of the things that she's actually, she was greatly expert, she had great expertise in, was the surface decoration. And it's something that I tried very hard to introduce in my work and failed. Because it really just takes a person like Dave Slave or Ladi Kwale to have no sense of inhibition to actually make marks on a round piece of work that is so balanced, but also is narrative and actually tells a story about the location of the person, who she was, and what she did. And I'm not really surprised that both of us, without actually having met, we would end up choosing Ladi Kwale as somebody we epitomize, sort of. I'm glad that we weren't actually talking about the work, and we came up with that decision. But there are also other things in the show that have pieces like the earthenware slipware decoration, where we have a similar sensitivity in choice of objects.
Being in your studio, I mean, there's a million things I want to say, but maybe I'll start with being in your studio in your home yesterday and seeing, we could say, predecessors or allies in the material, but seeing these black burnished works and mixed colored works from Soweto.
From KwaZulu-Natal.
KwaZulu-Natal.
Yeah.
And then seeing the works from the Americas.
Yeah.
And looking at how transmission, I mean, the way that I got to Ladi Kwale wasn't through a relationship, because you had a relationship with Ladi as well.
Yeah, I actually worked with her for nearly 3 months.
Yeah.
Or rather, she taught me. What am I saying? I didn't work with her.
That's important.
She was too big. Yeah. She was too big for me to work with her. I learned how to hand build through, sort of from her.
Yeah. That for me, what was interesting in trying to make this exhibition make sense was that I wanted to acknowledge the fact that there was nothing that I was doing on the second floor that wasn't inspired by the field of ceramics and by people who I can, in some cases, name, and in other cases I can't name. And that in craftsmanship, I feel that there's a pride about that. I'm very excited that my instructor, Ingrid Lilligren's work is in a cabinet with her instructor, Paul Soldner's work, and that we all fired the same kilns in Tokonami, Japan. And that for me, the relationship between Ladi and Michael Cardew, and the idea that there were these transmissions that were happening, or that there were platforms that were being created because someone came to another place and said, hey, I like what you're doing. Can we do this together? Could we build this pottery? And that the push and pull of hand transmission refines us as makers, And so I also have to say that the pots that are on the second floor, those pots wouldn't have been what they are if it wasn't for my dear friend Koichi Ohara, a colleague, Jordan Taylor, Gavin Chura, that these are the men and women who are in my studio every day, and we have to make decisions about what's the relationship between the shoulder and the neck. Is there a clear move? Is there a clear move from this shoulder to this neck? Or is that thing like this? Or is this thing like this? Or is this thing like this? And that those subtleties, for me at least, there are moments where my co-creator or my colleague or a young workshop member can't answer that question for me and maybe doesn't know how to resolve a shoulder without that shoulder collapsing. And that all these things, and then you get to the possibility that within clay, there is right and wrong. And clay will tell you wrong. It won't work. You know what I mean? And I think that then being in your studio yesterday, what it made me feel was you've spent a lot of time asking yourself questions about, does it work?
I think there is that. But I think the beauty about clay is that also anything can work and anything works. When you think about young children, one of the experiences I always cherish is being left with about 25 rising fives. They were 4.5 coming into 5-year-olds, and being absolutely terrified by this group of kids who suddenly were all eager to have, a piece of clay to roll in their hands, and each one of them wanting to show off what they were doing. But what it taught me is the humanity of clay, the fact that this small piece of dirt, as you called it, can go into a 4-year-old's hands, and they can hold it like that, roll it around, and then start pinching. And not only did it teach me how to learn about my own hands and the possibilities of my own hands, but it taught me how to teach, but how to learn as well. Because these children, this is why I say that anything can be made out of clay. And it's only when it's fired that you realize whether it worked or not. But they just naturally pinched that clay around and came up with a little bowl. But the way they used their hands and they showed it to you made me realize that you had to learn how to really appreciate working with clay. You had to use your whole hand, and right from sort of palm of your hands to the middle and to the tips of the fingers. But it's the natural way that they did. And then their whole demeanor, their whole posture in the way they received this, and then they brought it to me to actually assess what they were doing, was all this outer space, this outer form that has become a big concern for me, the idea of the outer unknown space that's created by a ceramic form, which is a little bit like architecture as well.
I want to go back to this point about transmission, and Theaster mentioned it in terms of his teacher and his teacher's teacher, but there's also, I see through some of your selections, a much longer trajectory of transmission. There's a pot that you selected for your Fitzwilliam show that I thought looks exactly like one of the African vessels that you decided to tar, Theaster, but I found out that it was actually from the South Pacific, from Vanuatu. That's one of the incredible things, that something could have traveled thousands and thousands of miles and centuries or millennia.
I have to thank the archaeologist or an anthropologist, or maybe archaeologist in Cambridge. But clay, and I've always said that, and people in the audience who know me, I've continuously state that clay is one of the most universal material that is used to make form vessels, whether it's figurative or a container that contains something, throughout civilization and throughout societies. There isn't a single society, and sort of even in contemporary world, if you go to any museum, there isn't a single museum that doesn't have a piece of clay on display, because it does tell history. It's one of the few materials that actually survives millennia. It's the material that tells archaeologists what it is happened 50,000 millennium years ago. It is one of those materials that survives in shipwrecks, but also in fires or anything, whether it's brick or a vessel or anything. It has that durability, but it has its vulnerability as well. But it's a universal thing. When I was working with Lydia, or even when I was working with Zoe Ellison, the teacher who introduced me to clay, we didn't need a literary language to understand each other.
Yeah.
It was almost performance. And it's a visual sort of performance. So it's a visual activity that anybody can take, can participate in.
The face jug from South Carolina, possibly from the same community of makers that David Drake comes from. It's tiny, it's got a face, and it doesn't look like it would have a function. But somehow it seems maybe that it might have a connection to, for example, Ninkisi figures in the Congo. I don't know if you had thought about that, Theaster, and how that form may have come down, and would it have had a purpose? Or?
Well, I mean, I think about, if we could just stay on transmission for a little bit longer, I really think the first time I went to Cape Town and I saw gumboot dancers, and I went to this party and these guys, they were dancing, and I was like, oh. Like, I felt like whatever I was doing in the States was an attempt to keep back my body because nobody else wanted to cut loose like I did. And then I got to South Africa, and it was like I was coming home. And then at this party, I was just like, oh, those movements, those body forms feel so familiar to me. They're in my body. I don't know how they're in my body. The first time I went to Puerto Rico, no one taught me how to salsa dance. And it's like, let's just say I picked it up pretty quick. Right? But I remember being there and this sister asking me, she was from Catalina, she was like, you dance like you're from the Dominican, from the DR. I didn't know what that meant. And I think what she was saying was that my salsa was like loose in a way that Puerto Rican salsa was maybe a little tighter, right? Or these moments where I remember someone sharing that Martha Graham went to a Southeast Asian country and they were playing something, and then in procession, she did their dance. Transmission in that sense. I can think about dance and transmission. But I think that there are moments when we are carriers of information. And in this way that you're talking about the performative aspect, it feels like what you mean is like someone could be doing something right there. They don't have to say, pinch it hard or pinch it soft. Information is going in. And I remember earlier, in my career, I remember using the word impartation a lot. Like impartation had something to do with like the transmission that happens when somebody touches you. Like they ain't got to say all the stuff, but imparting is like more information went in than anything that was said, right? And I feel like I learned ceramics like that. That it wasn't like, and it wasn't like a yoga class where it's like, and roll 7 times, feel the clay through your fingers. The clay should, you know what I mean? It was like, if you roll it too much, it's gonna break. And in a way, you don't need a whole lot of, like the clay, the material will tell you things. But I really think that after, in this case now, one could observe vessels. And I love when painters look at paintings because they're looking for indications of something. And in that case, sometimes the painter doesn't have to tell you what they did. And when I look at these vessels, there are definitely moments where I feel like I need an education. And I'm like, how did she do that? You know, like they really do. They defy the wheel. Right.
Probably, but I was just going to go.
Come on.
I was just going to take the discussion away from me, but to just concentrate on that, you know, sort of the selection. I was thinking when you mentioned the South Carolina piece of work and the Vanuatu piece, when you look at it, both of them are actually very figurative. Both of them are actually telling a message. Those South Carolina pieces were made by people who were trying to say something so that the slave owner didn't know what they were doing. The Vanuatu pieces, and if you look at people from that area, they have a lot of tattooing, and that piece actually tells very much of where it comes from. But if you take the two pieces together and you take the Ladiquale pieces or any of the Kadu pieces, they're all narrative. Mm-hmm. They're all telling a story. The stories may be interpreted by other people differently. Mm-hmm. The people from that location will know exactly what the pieces are. In Ladiquale's surfaces, she's the only one who drew those chameleons and lizards in that same way. And if you had gone to a marketplace on the day when pots were being sold, Ladiquale's pieces would have been sold out before the market even opened, because everybody could identify them. Yet all the people around the Gwari area, around Tatiko and those areas, make pots exactly the same way. They decorate the lizards exactly the same way. But each person has their own way and their own story. And so there's an identity that is also displayed or narrated in the work, but also the work tells about the group that the people comes from. So when you look at the South Carolina piece, you look at the Vanuatu piece, you look at pieces from early sort of, or the Thomas Toft pieces that I have with depicting the Queen or something like that. They're all telling a story, and this is what is wonderful about art. And it is, as you said, sometimes a privilege to be doing it, but depicting work, making work, is an occupation that is, again, a universal occupation. It's done and made by practically everybody.
I wanted to turn a little bit more back to the question of the kind of direct cultural transmission in your learning of the craft of pottery. I think neither of you initially set out to study ceramics or clay.
No.
How did you first kind of encounter the medium, and which teachers made a difference for you?
Well, I'll try to offer this as a kind of transition from the face jug, because I think in addition, Magdalene, to the madam, in addition to the surface, I've been thinking a lot about the emotional and spiritual transmissions that happen when a maker chooses to put a face on a jug.
Yeah.
And that is not just surface decoration or storytelling alone, but in some cases they were pushing energy away, bringing energy toward a thing, acknowledging the history of souls and energies. And so there's this other part about the vessel that has to do with the invisibility, the things that are invisible, the spells that one might conjure, the things that you say while you're making, the music that you're listening to, or the songs that you sing into the vessel. Esperanza Spalding would call those like spells or cantations. You know what I mean? But I think that there is also this part where if a person who's not literate in the spiritual world looks at a South Carolinian face jug and says, "Oh, all the faces look mean. All the faces are like seemingly ugly," and it's like what they're attempting to acknowledge the fact that there might be other things happening in the narrative that is invisible. And that is doing another kind of work in the world of the invisible. So I would say at the moment that I was starting to study ceramics, I was also minister of music at my college church. And that for me, I was already a believer in things like we were always looking at crosses. And we were always told that there's power in that thing, and there's a power over here, and that power comes through that thing, and that thing has the ability to come. And in that sense, objects were given power. And that I developed a pretty significant investment in believing that a prayer could be attached to a kerchief, and that kerchief could heal. That in a way, the invisible power could be made tangible. And that one could grab that tangible thing out of the mail and one's life could be changed. So I think that maybe I feel like when I was learning ceramics, it was quite a shamanistic activity because it was part what I did on Saturday nights, which was like I would be in the clay studio all weekend. And I would wake up and go to church. And then when my spiritual life changed, it didn't change the fact that I believe that objects carry in them deep spiritual possibility, potential. And I think that in that sense, I always knew that clay, it seemed like clay would be the tool of my conjuring. It was too early to know that at the time, but I knew that it would be a life relationship, even if it was a hobby to my urban planning studies or my profession as a planner. I knew clay would be in my life. I just wanted to be in that material a lot. Even as in the contemporary art world, I was doing other things, I always kept the wheel close and the clay table fresh.
I think for me it was really a rude awakening, I think, or a discovery. But it's probably my aversion to, or my realization that I really did not like commercial art and advertising. And I think, thankfully, I was training for that. But had I gone into, say, book illustration or something else that I had wanted to do, maybe I would never have touched clay. But it's the aversion for what advertising was all about, particularly at the time that I came from England. We'd only had independence, I think in 1963 in Kenya. And for me, coming to England, and engaging in commercial art, it was a time when we were having, for instance, Nestle was advertising a milk powder in developing countries for mothers, and there was a lot of Coca-Cola coming up, and it was that aversion of advertising for materialism. So it was a kind of political conflict that I was going through that became a conflict in my own self. So, sort of when Zoe Ellison, my teacher, said, "Well, I think you might be happier engaging in a craft," I had to think twice and wonder what I would do when I got home, because if I went, because the plan was that I'd go back to Kenya, and what would I tell my folk and anybody who'd been party to my coming to England, because you can't explain having come to England to make pots, to go back. But you could explain going back to work in a wonderful, nice office and making adverts and telling people to use soap powder instead of sunlight soap, when you knew that they couldn't afford that. So it was that. And I think my engagement, my spiritual engagement with clay became exactly that. I started looking at how clay became a material that mediated so many other aspects. You mentioned the church aspect, but also, for instance, there's some of the most wonderful pieces of ceramics that I love looking at, pots from the Benue Plateau in Nigeria that are purposely made as part of healing pots, and they're commissioned by a healer to enable him to heal, and the pots are made with nodules, and you notice a lot of them on my work as well. And the notion of coughing out, that ails you to make you more wholesome and peaceful is a very, very important aspect of the notion of what a vessel contains. So it's much more than just making a gesture to make a pot. For me, it embraces the whole life. So the sort of going from Cambridge on, and the exhibition at the Fitzwilliam is really dedicated to the 2 years I spent in Cambridge, and then discovering Ladi Kwale, and then subsequently other teachers like Henry Hammond, at college. It's those people that I worked with also embody this kind of quietness that is to do with vessel making.
In both your cases, I think in the intervening years between your studies and today, there's a departure from some of your earlier forms. And I wonder where you seek to look for form now, and what do you think form brings to the work?
I think for me, there's certainly a historical basis because of the intellectual engagement with the whole of my art life. And so the notion of looking, searching, understanding, studying, and what art school now calls research, in inverted commas, but it's essential. But for me, it is to do with movement, to do with observing every day, abstracting information through just sometimes just gazing at, sort of make, the space and finding form within that to go and look at. But my initial starting process starts with drawing. And I still love life drawing. I still love drawing things next to each other because I think we see form because form exists in a space. And I love the relationship between the emptiness and the solidity that is offered. And that's what architecture does as well. You always have, and ceramics is great for that because it always has a wall. And between that wall, you've got the outside and a glaze, and then the inside. And the dialogue between the contained and uncontained is quite an interesting one, but a challenging one as well, especially in my work because, I think in both of our work, sometimes, and in most cases, you don't see the inside of the work. But I like to concentrate on making the inside really perfect because the outside takes care of itself.
Maybe we can shift to the question of
knowledge. That's knowledge right there. Quote that one.
I didn't mean to be polemic.
It's amazing.
I mean, you raised the question or the relationship of container and vessel to architecture. And this is, I think, something Theaster is very connected to in both your work, but also your wider social practice.
Yeah, well, I think I should start by saying that ceramics was like a gateway drug. I think everybody gets that metaphor.
Yes.
Yeah, ceramics was a gateway material for me because it kind of helped me understand the formal possibilities of form. And there was a period when there were things that I wanted to say socially, politically, or I wanted to extend certain conversations, and I didn't feel like I had the aptitude or the capacity. The material didn't always work for me. So in some ways, I would say that I left clay for contemporary art because I wasn't good enough as a maker in clay to say all the things I wanted to say. In contemporary art was easier. But then
how do you define contemporary? And
I'm actively talking now about a time when craft would not give me an exhibition at a museum.
Yeah.
And that as soon as I could no longer afford my clay studio, which coincided with this desire to say other things, the contemporary art world was interested in the thing just beyond the clay thing.
I want to make a film about clay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember my first projects were, I thought, okay, I can't afford clay anymore. And this guy had offered me all these wooden boards. And these wooden boards, I could stack them. And it was like, oh, it's a wooden version of clay. It allows me to like make form over and over again, reuse the thing. And I was broke. So I was like, oh, I'm going to be a stacker. And I went from a potter to a stacker.
Yeah.
And people thought that me stacking these wooden boards was the most contemporary thing. That in fact, I used those boards in 7 shows that eventually got me an exhibition at the Whitney Biennial 2010. And so the first time that I used the boards, the installation was called Forest for Tea. And it was all the boards stacked into a forest. And then there were like 3 tea bowls. That was still not far from clay, you know?
Yeah.
I mention that because I feel like in a way, formal knowledge of ceramics informed my ability to move through other materials because I had all these histories of like Korean painting, scrolls, Chinese calligraphy, Bauhausian activity, Black Mountain College and Karen Carnes and Peter Voulkos. And it was like there were all these precedences that I was learning through the history of clay that gave me knowledge of how form works. And then, let's say, my preoccupation with the vessel, I would say, of recent has everything to do with language. I didn't draw, I would read. Mm-hmm. And it was actually Herbert Reed, who I've been talking about for the last 4 or 5 years. It was Reed's work where Herbert Reed was a poet and a writer on his own, but he was also assigned to the British Museum, maybe the V&A, to reflect on British ceramics and craft. My short read of him was that he would say, in a way, the plastic arts gave way for the possibility of modernism. And that because people could pinch and pull and stretch, and because this material was plastic, we could make forms that couldn't be imagined if you were working in other materials. So in a way, art or Henry Moore, people couldn't have imagined their forms if it wasn't for this material. And so my preoccupation with vessels as of late is an ongoing demonstration to myself and maybe to others at the intellectual plasticity that potters have. Not only the material plasticity, right? And so in that sense, the material feels so, like it's such a great educator. Yeah. And it could be as polemic or as flat-footed as one needs it to be. But I imagine that there's a tremendous amount of just deep knowing. And because I was in love with the material, it made me more inclined as a young person to read about it, right? Because I was a zealot. So it was like I wanted to read everything I could about the material and about the weird people around the world who were doing weird things with the material. And people were doing weird and interesting things. You know, to imagine that this material would be a stand-in for one's kingdom, and that one could bury those things, and that would be representational of the things that they would have in the afterworld. That without burying those things, one wouldn't have their favorite dog, they wouldn't have their soldiers, they wouldn't have their home, and it's like, wow, this material is holding so much for us in this world and in other worlds. I think there's something there.
You've ended up with that word. Taking the clay. I mean, for me, it was the opposite, because I've been really patient over 40 years to try and just pare down and make and distill every of that block of wood and everything into just a simple form, and found that I could actually lose myself in that. But I just want to go back to sort of this notion of burial, which you touched on a bit. Some of the most wonderful pieces that we find that have survived have been pots or vessels or bowls that were meant to take you into the afterlife, including the terracottas, sort of in China, but some of Southwest Coast American pots with, sort of the Nimbra pots with, where you put a hole in to let the spirit breathe. But the potter or the artist would have spent a lot of time making them so delicate. The caramel pots from North Sudan, Southern Sudan. You got them in the pyramids as well when they were uncovered. These pots are the finest, the most contemporary, the most amazing pieces that have been made and are still made. And you talked about history. The reason why pots are so engaging is this timelessness that they have within that canon of art, and that you can get a very simple pot from Kamau, from early Egypt, that is made of very, very basic clay. And that piece would still engage you in a museum when you look at it, and literally you want to cry just seeing the finesse of this work. But it's the contemporariness of ceramics that for me is very interesting. If you go to the V&A particularly, you see cabinets and cabinets of work. And sometimes it's very difficult to know the age of any of the work because it is very contemporary. And there's nothing that hasn't been done in clay before.
I wonder what you would both say about how important is cultural identity in your work, and what is the significance of Blackness? And it could be with a capital B or a lowercase b.
I would like to flip that and go echo Eshun and say, what is whiteness? Is that an identity? But having said that, I think art in general is very much a means of expression and a means of identifying one's own cultural background. And I don't think there's I mean, I wouldn't want to use the word blackness or whiteness or whatever in work. I'd like to use the word, I like to kind of talk about ceramics, particularly in pots, being a very universal sort of identifier of cultural traditions and cultural norms. And you can actually tell those cultural differences through the work that is displayed, but in the end, a pot is a pot. A figurative a piece of ceramics or clay is a pot as well, because a pot is or vessel is not necessarily just a hollow piece with a wall, but it embraces every. I mean, we human beings are vessels. Ships are vessels, and so it is more than that, sort of. And clay, I am a fanatic of clay, and I think clay has the capacity to have an identity and help us identify. That's why archaeologists have jobs. Because they take these shards and put them in pieces to tell you how those people 1,000 years ago, maybe more, 5,000, 20,000 years ago, lived and what they ate and what they, So it gives us, it mediates this, it transfers a lot more than just being a piece of object in front of us. And I think your work does that too, because there are a lot of, I mean, I think Theaster packs in so much in a piece of bowl that you can stand there and be mesmerized, but study it for hours on end. But it does, sort of. I think it's Chris Grayling who once said, sort of making objects is a vital aspect of human condition, of humanity, because it makes history. So once you've, sort of, but clay outlasts all the other. So all of you go make pots.
It's funny, and maybe we'll make this a closing remark, at least for me. This part of the conversation really makes me wish that racism didn't exist, and that I remember the day that I asked Ingrid, who's my ceramic instructor, like, how's it that I've now done 3 semesters with you and we've only talked about white male potters? Everybody who was told to be great, study this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy. And it wasn't so much that I needed a black potter, because it was Ingrid that told me about Dave, the potter, in 93, 94. It's not that I needed one, I just needed to know that the world wasn't working against us. And that when I started studying about Dave, I then learned that there were industrial plantations. People talk about picking cotton and shit. Pardon me.
Yeah.
But there were
I'll
makers.
allow you that.
There were makers who were doing industrial work,
Yeah.
early labor, and their names are not on those pots like Dave's are. So the attributions that we give to a North Carolinian slave name could have been a black maker, but it is attributed to a white maker. So I think that I had certain preoccupations. And I remember thinking, like, these flat plates don't hold collard greens right. My mama's juice, we got juice. If you got neck bones and collard greens and you trying to smash that with some cornbread, there's no lip, there's no rim on this plate,
Yeah.
I got a problem. And so it was like a certain kind of ceramic object was not working for the foods of black people, let's say,
Yeah.
if we're talking
Yeah.
handmade things. And so in that sense, race would show up in a way that, like if I was just being a practical potter, that there wasn't room for certain foods on certain plates. And so it was like, oh, I could consider the foods of my mama, my family of black people, and I could probably make a better vessel for our foods, because no one's really had to, there's been no potter that I know of that was making a collard green plate so that as much juice as I wanted, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's that. And then I think that there was a moment where I was actively trying to offer I was offering blackness to craft as a kind of demonstrative act. I didn't know Magdalene, but I knew that there was something in the vessel that spoke to me of blackness. I don't want to put that on you, but I'm putting it on the vessel.
I take that and I understand that, but what I'm trying to say is that because my work has always kind of engaged, it was deliberate to want to celebrate the work of makers from my tradition. And the fact that it was led by Lydia, the realization that unless I made an effort to make the work that I'm making, the African potter would not actually be recognized. And I think for me, going back to Kenya and having an exhibition there, and my own people suddenly saying, oh my goodness, we didn't know you could, clay could do this, is a realization that the education that I had had negated that identity. and
The
that
Kenyan
it was
education.
the Kenyan education, which was a very British education.
Yeah.
I grew up in a colonial Kenya.
Yeah.
And so I have kind of quietly wanted to raise that bar, but to make that history in a way that is painful, but speaks for itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I would also say that the evidence of Japan and Korea is as obvious in my hands as the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s.
Sure.
And so, you know, it would be unreasonable to look at an image like that and say composition was informed by Japan. And so I think that it is not only Blackness that I'm fighting for, I'm also fighting for this small town Tokoname, where they produced a lot of amazing makers, and that there are traditions there that could in a couple generations be gone and not known anymore. In the same way that, you know, there are traditions in my family's culture that might be lost. Like the fact that I sometimes say I'm a roofer, or I'm at least the son of a roofer, I'm happy to be carrying those things. And so I just think that making art, and this is back to art versus craft or whatever, the fact that there is transmission, and I no longer feel like we no longer have to make these designations, these delineations. I feel like we're almost there, you know, that the advocacy work, that clay is now in the zone. And I think if you're a potter in the audience, beware, because the galleries will be looking for your ass just after this show.
But I would sort of follow that by saying there's an urgency for me, particularly coming from the continent of Africa. And there's an urgency to try and make and elevate crafts, art in general, in a way that I have a colleague here, Michael Armitage. We're all fighting to try and we're fighting against what we call sufurias, aluminum containers that are replacing traditional ceramics, sort of telephone wire baskets, beautiful as they are, but replacing raffia. You know, you go to Congo and the Kuba print, the Kuba weaving is almost dying. So there's an urgency for elevating craft, for getting it into this contemporary world, so that there would be younger generations in Kenya particularly who will appreciate the making with clay and with other materials. Otherwise, we're losing it. Some of the most beautiful pots that are made from Kenya come from a place called from Turkana area, the Marakwet people. And these pieces were huge pots that were made and then lined with hide. And they're so sculptural, even Volcos would have died for them. They're not being made anymore. So for me, the urgency is, the identity is within that loss of a cultural identity through making. And it's a double edge for somebody who comes from Kenya, who was brought up in a colonial Kenya, because we've had to relearn, we've had to try and own this, and it's easily lost because the industrialization and the changes in climate, in whatever it is. So this whole notion of blackness and whiteness is intertwined for me with a colonial kind of mentality, but a liberation that perhaps has not been realized through being, I don't know, through being free, but not being free. So there's a lot more work to do.
I'd like to give the audience a chance to join into this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And can I say thank you to the Whitechapel, to Theaster, to Magdalene. I thought that was absolutely beautiful. And after, 18, 19 months of what we've been through, just coming back together to share something as beautiful as that, it just reminds one of how important institutions like this, how important creative people like you are, and to our wider well-being. And particularly that last passage of the conversation reminded me of a trip that I took when I was 16 or 17 to West Africa, and I was in northern Mali and was asked to join an archaeological dig. And this was an amazing kind of moment in which this French archaeological team had discovered a medieval midden mound, which was, I think, 16 feet deep. And it told the story of this bit of Mali through its ceramics. Just layers and layers of history. Yeah. And for me, as a young student who was traveling in Africa, trying to connect to a history that I had been told didn't exist, let alone that it was going to be tough to discover, that it was a really emotional moment for me, and that feeling has never left me, of the connectivity that one gets from ceramics to narrative and also to that other thing, which I think this particular conversation has reminded me of, that we've actually been lacking over this last 18 months, that sense of hope within the continuity as well. Yeah. You know, you've worked with Obama, and that idea of investing kind of consciously in hope through narrative, of passing things down generation over generation, of investing in tradition of ceramics somehow defying time, and of hope also doing that thing too. And I just wondered, you know, in this moment in which it feels like there are kind of terrible retrenchments and polarizations, in which there are huge challenges in terms of politics and race, sorts of challenges to things that we thought we wouldn't have to countenance again. I mean, are you hopeful? Do you feel a sense that for the next generation that we will be able to hand on a baton and give them a sense of optimism, particularly as one thinks about creativity?
Well, I think, thank you. I think the first part of what you were suggesting for me is that clay is a kind of evidence that we live. And I think part of the reason that I haven't run totally away from the art world is because the work will be the proof to the future that we are here.
Yeah. And I'm very hopeful, particularly if I want to confine it to just my home country, Kenya. And the boundaries in Kenya were formed in colonial days. I come from, my antecedents come from the border of now Uganda, Kenya, and southern Sudan. But there's a lot of hope, especially in a country like Kenya, where you're getting a lot of young people starting up cooperatives, making art, and actually really breaking through and setting up. I want to give my hand up for Michael. He's setting up a studio, but there are others as well in shanty towns and wherever. But there is
Ibrahim's
a
in
step.
Ghana doing some cool
There is a step in their gait. You know, when they're walking, they're much more hopeful than we were, and much, you know, sort of every time I voice a fear of aluminium pots and pans that, by the way, get, you know, holes and whatever, and you need charcoal to cook on sufurias, which means you're cutting down trees and all that. But there seems to be a lot of hope, and I think they will survive and they will continue making better than we did, perhaps. And we can only be exemplars as we go on. But I think his, you know, sort of making will continue to make history and to survive us. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Slightly different sort of question, but I was wondering about the relationship of repetition and creativity, and how that works for you both.
Well, when I was coming up learning about contemporary art, there was a guy named Boetti. And I understood that he made work in series. And then I heard about, you know, a woman named Eva Hesse. And then started thinking about this guy, Donald Judd, quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize at the time that maybe work in series was also potentially related to some kind of consumer activity. But as it were, being trained as a potter, well, I would just make a bowl and then another bowl and then another bowl, and usually none of them were good. Over time, I had to decide to keep some of them and just be slightly disappointed with the result, but I would keep them nonetheless. And so I think that in being trained as a potter, the idea of repetition felt quite natural. When I started to switch to other materials that were outside of clay, I carried that impulse with me, so that it was like, oh, for the tar paintings, let's try 20. 12 will suck. But it was the act of applying the underlayment, torching that underlayment, practicing how to torch underlayment, then mopping and then putting them in the heat and watching them fail, and to the point where you actually learn about the material enough that you can kind of have more command with the material, right? And so there's a part of me that really thinks that I became a better potter younger because I was doing it all day, every day. And that repetition was the thing that eventually allowed me to then teach a bit, give correction, look at a pot and see its heaviness. You know, I have to admit, yesterday I was very, very pleased at the weight of things in Magdalene's studio. They were quite light, you know, and I think that Magdalene has a control. She has maybe a different goal, but these pots right here, they're not light. You know, they are not light. And
They're grounded.
They're grounded, yes. Bottom heavy, we say. But I do think, you know, I'm trying to answer the question of repetition, but also a way of working where right now I feel so invested in vessel making in my ceramic life and in brick production. So that in this case, brick production and repetition allows for the construction of a nation. It's like the repetition does another thing, which We're making better bricks. I know more about the properties of bricks, but also the accumulative nature of that modular material means that I can go from a small scale to the Serpentine Pavilion next year, which is really nice.
Yeah, I think for me, repetition, the word has two meanings for me. I mean, if I were to train as a marathon runner, I would have to train every day to make that 50 miles or 26 kilometers. And I think it just makes it better. I mean, I look at Lydia pieces, and she drew those chameleons and lizards day in, day out, and each one was different. It's like the frogs, toads. I think there is something about trying to perfect the piece that you made, and the next one, and the next one. I just don't think perfection is that easy. I've always said, if one day I make that perfect bowl, I'll cease to be a potter. But it is a very difficult thing to achieve, you know, to just make anything perfect. We wouldn't be. And probably that's why God rests knowing that he's making new people every day.
That's good.
You had said that our generation walks with a skip in our step, you know, and there is a lot of excitement. But that really is only because yourselves and your generation and the generations before us have cleared the way. And a lot of what we're doing is really built on everything that has come before. And we are able to skip because there's a path,
Yeah.
you know, like it really is. The respect should go to you and your generation.
Oh, thank you. But I just add that we all have a responsibility. We are given these, I don't know whether to call them talents or ability and tenacity. And we have to use them with responsibility for the future, I think. And I think ceramics or art in general, but clay particularly, is very relevant because it's part of the earth, and if we misuse it, the next generations will pay for it, I think.
I wanted to mention Simone Fatale, another artist who works in ceramics, with her exhibition happening at the same time. I would love to get your view on her work and to hear what you think of her sculptures.
I've always liked her work.
Yes.
So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
you know, I've always loved her work.
Same. In my meditation time, I actually just kind of stood in the gallery, and I thought that the work it has its own material poetry, you know, and the work, both the clay work and the drawings, you know, I felt in the way that language can do. It had the ability to offer nuance to the material that felt like it was from a slightly different place than my place, and that being rooted in that room felt really good, and you know, one of the things that I love most, Auntie.
I'll never forget this.
One of the things that I love most is that because I grappled with race so much in the United States, clay was one of the ways that I could get out of a black-white binary.
Yeah.
That clay immediately offered me exit out of the race dilemma in the United States, and it offered me instead a pantheon of amazing makers around the world who were excited to have apprentices who were simply enthusiastic about the material. And when I would go to Japan, and after these brothers interrogated me and realized that I could work, they were just like, oh, you're not lazy. And that the qualifier was just the willingness to be with the material. In a way, I'll always say that I don't think that my role in life was to be a great potter. But I do think that, and my instructor also told me very early on, those handles just won't make it, you know? But I think that there was something for me that by exiting the black-white binary, I could then use my other interests and abilities to advocate for the field in a much more broader way, and then use the platform of the contemporary art world to not only talk about Blackness, or not only have a band called the Black Monks and think about seemingly esoteric things, but I could also be an advocate for craft within contemporary art in a way that it would be respected. And so I know that I'm involved in a politic as much as I am a practice. I'll take it.
You guys talked a little bit about underrepresented sort of practices in sort of Japan and Kenya. I wanted to ask, how do you think technology developing, particularly thinking about 3D printing within clay and stuff, kind of affects that? Do you think it'll help bring to light, or do you think it'll kind of provide more of a struggle, I guess, for technology as a whole? How do you think it will affect?
I find it a struggle, but having said that, I mean, Kenya, you mentioned Kenya is one of the central places where a lot of these things are being tested. Kenya had M-Pesa, was it internet or mobile banking? It's had it for years. And now the rest of the world, America, is taking that notion and testing it. So I just think, I mean, maybe I'm biased about Kenya, but Kenya is really the place to be going. It really is. I mean, M-Pesa, it's now tested. It's being tested in South Africa. But I don't think anybody has a checkbook in Kenya. Yeah. I still have a checkbook. But they all, even in the rural areas. Yeah. So I think technology is here to stay. Yeah. I mean, I really struggle with it. But I know it's here to stay. Fortunately, I don't need to have to know it much.
Yeah, I think another truth is that there was a period where we could only get the firing temperature in a kiln up to 1,700 degrees, and then we were able to get it up to 2,300 degrees, and that represented its own kind of technology, and as a result, China was able to make a thing called porcelain with a material that was right under its digital feet. Yeah. And so if part of what you're saying, if part of what we're talking about, for me at least, is the hand and the machine, I would say I would never want to lose that balance, or I would never want to lose the hand, and I would always advocate for the hand. But I think that the technology in the minds and in philosophies of good people don't bother me. But technology unregulated and without mindfulness scares me a lot. I really curb not swearing right there. It scares me a lot. So I think as I'm thinking about albums in the analog. An album is a technology from the voice. It's like, why do we need a recording of the thing when one could simply do the thing? Yeah. Yet, I'm so glad
I
we
think
have.
that's a cue for
No,
you
no,
to.
no, no. Thank you so much. See you at church on Sunday. I'll be singing then. Lydia, thank you so
Yeah,
much
thank you.
for
Thank
this.
you for a
Magdalene,
fabulous
thank you.
talk
Thank you.
and
Thank you
evening.
for inviting us.